help someone who sees the world differently, especially when even they don't know they do. The best we can do is prepare in advance for potential differences. In this module, I'll introduce the idea of universal design for learning. We'll begin with background information, and then we'll talk about the principles of universal design for learning, and then its application in higher education. This idea was developed based on the concept of universal design in architecture from the early 1970s. The idea of universal design was to create spaces that are usable by all or most without further modifications. Design it right from the beginning, and you do not need to go back and adapt it later. A good example of this in architecture is adding a ramp onto a sidewalk. The ramp can be used by anyone who will benefit and will then benefit many others. The original intention was for the sidewalk to be accessible for those with mobility issues. However, I would be able to pull a wagon or a cart of books onto the sidewalk much easier because I could use the ramp. It's easier to design the ramp when you're making the sidewalk than it is to go back and cut out a workable ramp later on. In the late 1980s, the Center for Applied Special Technologies, or CAST, brought this concept into education and developed the idea of universal design for learning. This idea helps to make learning spaces universal, not just accessible. So your learning spaces and your learning materials are more accessible for everyone. A good definition is the intentional design of courses and learning spaces that include and address a wide variety of learning styles and individual needs. So take a moment to think about your students and think about your classes. Do you know all of their learning preferences? Do you know all of their backgrounds? Do you know what prior knowledge they bring into your classroom or prior experiences they bring into your classroom? Do you know their abilities or their disabilities? Do you know all of the ways they might be different from each other? Universal design for learning anticipates diversity in the learners and takes their needs into consideration from the very beginning when you're planning your course. So let's think of a good example in a college classroom. So a history professor is teaching a class on pop culture. You've designed a fully interactive lesson in which the students are going to experience the disco era by learning some disco dance moves. You're excited about it until Joe comes into class and he's on crutches. He broke his leg in the big game over the weekend, and suddenly your heart sinks. How is Joe going to participate in disco day when he's on crutches? You're scrambling at the last minute to try to come up with something that Joe can do so he can have fun learning also along with the rest of his class. Now rewind and plan this lesson universally. When you're planning, you think about how someone with limited mobility could participate. Maybe you have some tambourines at the ready. Maybe you plan for a student to be the DJ. You might even want some adoring, swooning fans to be part of the audience. Now, when Joe comes in, you immediately know that you have something for him to do. And your attitude has changed. You have time to focus on Joe and on listening to a story about the big game instead of stressing out about how to make your lesson work. Your plan included options for diverse students, so all could be accommodated. You've anticipated potential needs, and even though you were not aware of those needs ahead of time, you were ready with a variety of options in case they were needed. And if Joe wasn't injured, you could still have someone choose to be a tambourine player or not. In a chemistry lab, the students need to read the burettes at the right angle so you can see the meniscus level. Short students or those in wheelchairs cannot accurately read a burette with a normal lab bench height. A universally designed lab space would have benches at various levels to allow all students access to the lab without adaptations. There are 3 principles of universal design for learning. The first is to provide multiple means of engagement. This is the why. These are the hooks, the things to get them excited and engaged in their learning. The second is multiple means of representation. This is the what. These are your learning materials. These are your teaching strategies, the way you present your information. And the third one is multiple means of action and expression. This is the how, the student work products, the ways that they show you that they've learned. The key concepts in Universal Design for Learning: you have to include flexibility in your planning, and you have to plan ahead. You have to think about all of the potential needs of the students before they get to your classes. If you follow these principles, then you are maximizing every student's opportunities, multiple opportunities, to interact with the information. You're providing multiple ways for them to engage, for them to get the information, and for them to show that they truly understand what you've been teaching. The CAST website has a ton of great information that will be really helpful to you as you're thinking about universally designing your lessons. It shows the multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression, and it gives you examples for each one. So let's look in a little more detail about each one. For engagement, how can you motivate the students to be actively engaged? Think about the students thinking, why should I learn this? Some points to consider. Find ways to appeal to the student interest, multiple ways. The students don't have the same interests, so you're going to need to address their interests in many ways. Consider opportunities to increase choice. Are there a variety of ways that you can get them engaged? Can some watch a video to gather information? Can others listen to a podcast or something in audio form to get the information? Can you also have some reading options for those who want to read the information? And encourage students to work together, especially in this engagement piece, where their output is not really part of it, it's what they're putting into it and what they're bringing into it. So if you can encourage them to work together to get engaged in the topic, then they'll be ready when they come into the class. The second principle is representation. How can your instruction increase learning and help students gain independence in the learning process? This is really the bulk of your instruction, so this is where I have the most points for consideration. Use various means for presenting your information. Don't just use lecture, but use some other options as well. Throw in some technology tools. Think about potential barriers ahead of time. If there's a student in the class who might have hearing difficulties, what are some other ways that you can make sure that they get that information? Encourage students to reflect on their process of learning and think back about what they've learned. And clarify vocabulary in the language of learning. My favorite example for this is going back to elementary school days with the nursery rhyme, Little Miss Muffet. Children can learn this rhyme, but just because they know the words and the rhyme, they likely have no idea what Miss Muffet sat on. What is a tuffet? When presenting this to young children, it would take just a few seconds to show a picture of a tuffet and explain that it's a soft covered stool. You could even bring a tuffet into the class so the students could sit on it like Miss Muffet. You could do the same thing with curds and whey. Provide the experience in a variety of ways, and the students will begin to visualize Miss Muffet upon her tuffet eating her curds and whey. I know that's a very primary example, but it illustrates the point. You need to activate prior knowledge or provide that prior knowledge. You need to provide scaffolding for them so they can increase their learning, and you need to offer a variety of visualization strategies. The last principle is action and expression. How can students act on their learning? What are the variety of ways in which learning can be demonstrated? So, points to consider here. Include opportunities to informally demonstrate learning. Throughout your class, throughout your learning process, build in times where students can talk to you or share in some way what it is that they're learning so far. Again, providing that scaffolding for them. Provide options in the final product when possible. If it's not required for everybody to do their final product the same way, open it up for different options and different chances to show what they've learned in different ways. Vary the method of sharing what was learned. And encourage the students to set goals and reflect on their learning. So why does this matter in the college classroom? The Individuals with Disabilities Act mandates that students in pre-K through 12 schools be provided with free, appropriate public education, but no such mandate is in place for higher education. However, most students do not suddenly lose the need for accommodations when they graduate high school. They still have the needs, and they're on their own to advocate for themselves. In higher education, it often falls onto the student to provide information to the college or university about disabilities and learning differences. However, if an institute of higher education is viewed as a component of society, and part of the mission is to educate our students for the betterment of society, the responsibility for providing an accessible learning environment also falls to the instructor. Something to think about. Do you know every identified learning problem of every student in your class? What about learning preferences, physical limitations, medical needs, home situations? Students come to you from a variety of situations with a variety of experiences and prior knowledge. Somehow, you have to provide the best learning opportunities for each student, no matter what he or she is bringing into the classroom. You are often not made aware of the needs unless it's shared by the student, and many students do not readily share their needs. They might not want to be seen as different, or they might be in a situation such as with color vision deficiencies, where they might not be aware that their needs are different from the needs of others. The goal for UDL in a classroom in college is to move from adaptation to anticipation. It's a changing in a mindset. So instead of making adaptations once you find out about the needs, you're anticipating the needs of the learners and providing instruction and learning environments that will meet those needs, your scaffolding. It is impossible to fully learn without the ability to perceive information. If a student is unable to perceive the information due to a sensory perception condition, such as color vision deficiencies, the only option is to memorize, which does not lead to long-term deep learning. My twins, with color vision deficiencies, had to memorize that red and blue are put together to make purple. They don't see that reaction happen. So for them, that's memorization. It's not long-term. They don't remember for the long term until they've worked with that information. If we see it, it's a deeper, different type of learning. Universal Design for Instruction, or Universal Design for Learning, is a good framework for reflective practice. It's a way to gauge how you're preparing your instruction. So what can you do? Think about a lesson that you teach regularly. What are some ways you can apply the principles of Universal Design for Learning in your lesson? Can you think of ways that you can provide multiple means of engagement? What do you do now? How can you increase those opportunities? Can you think of multiple ways you can represent the information, additional materials you might add, or additional activities, maybe again throwing in some of those technology tools? And think about those products, the way the students express their learning. How can you provide multiple means of expression? Providing an open classroom environment will encourage your students to share with you their needs and their concerns before you start those lessons. The more information you have, the more you are able to provide for the needs of your students. So start thinking universally. Start thinking as you're planning what are the ways that I can prepare my students for whatever need they might have to provide that information to maximize their learning. Thank you.